The Omega nursed the fever-sick stranger for 9 days. On the 10th he dissolved the auction. There was an old saying in the Thornvale Mountains, passed down in the kind of voices that crackling hearth fires made: "A wolf that cannot run still knows the way home." Seren Ashvale had heard it first from her mother, who had whispered it into her hair during the night they lost the cottage deed to Pack Ironmore's tax collector. Then from her grandmother, who repeated it the morning the healers confirmed Seren would never present a wolf. No shift, no howl, no beast in her blood, just the soft Omega designation, and a body that smelled of pine resin and old rain. The saying was supposed to be comfort. Most days it felt like kindness dressed up as a lie, but Seren kept it anyway, the way she kept everything she was not supposed to keep, carefully and close to the bone. She was 23 years old when a stranger collapsed in the snowfield behind her goat shed on the first night of the frost month, and the next 10 days remade the world she thought she knew. Chapter 1. The Man in the Snow. The goats woke her. Seren had learned to trust their noise the way other women trusted their wolves. Briar, the brown one with the crooked ear, only screamed in that particular register when something large was near, and whatever lay slumped against the eastern fence post was unquestionably large. She pulled on her wool boots and her dead father's coat, enormous, patched at both elbows, and took the lantern from its hook. The night was a flat, white silence. New snow had fallen, soft enough to blur footprints, and the temperature had dropped far enough that her breath arrived in brief, violent plumes. He was face down when she found him. She rolled him with effort, grunting, leveraging his dead weight with a fence post as a brace. His face, when it came into the light, was extraordinary in its damage. Not from violence, but from fever. The heat radiated off him before she even pressed her fingers to his jaw. Scorching. His skin had gone the color of wet clay, lips cracked white at the corners, and yet the architecture underneath was severe. A jaw like the prow of a ship, dark brows, a scar bisecting his left cheekbone that had healed clean and silver. He wore black traveling clothes with no pack insignia she recognized. No pack rings, no markings at all, which was strange enough that she scanned the tree line before she touched him again. A wolf without markings in Thornvale territory in winter was either hunted or hunting, and neither option made her feel settled. But the fever was catastrophic. She could feel it even through her gloves. A wolf that cannot run still knows the way home. She didn't know why the saying surfaced then. Perhaps because she had always interpreted it privately, in the direction she'd never admitted aloud. That home was not a pack or a place. Home was the thing you moved toward with all the capacity you had, even when the capacity was only your 2 arms and a borrowed fence post. She dragged him inside. Chapter 2. 9 days. It took 3 days before he could keep water down. Seren had no healer's training, only the practical education of a woman who had nursed a sick grandmother through 2 winters and learned which herbs the mountain offered freely. She packed yarrow at his throat, boiled willow bark tea until the whole cottage smelled of it, and changed his sweat-soaked linens twice a day, using an arrangement of ropes and rolled blankets that let her move him without help. He was delirious for most of the first 4 days. He spoke in fragments, names she didn't recognize, the word Valdrath repeated like a compass needle, and once, clearly in a voice suddenly stripped of its fever roughness. "Tell them I rescind it. All of it." Then the heat took him under again. She didn't search his coat until the 2nd day, when she needed to wash it. The interior pocket held 2 things: a ring bearing a signet she didn't recognize, a wolf's head inside a crown, and a folded document so dense with legal language that she only parsed the heading before she refolded it. Iron Compact of Thornvale, Article 9, Omega Auction Protocols, Cycle of the Frost Month. She set both items on the high shelf above the fireplace, where she set things that required thinking about later. On day 5, the fever broke. She knew it before she opened her eyes that morning because the quality of his breathing had changed, slower, deeper, no longer the labored rasp she'd been listening for in the dark. When she crossed the room and pressed her wrist to his forehead, it was simply warm. Human warm. Wolf warm. Not the furnace that had been eating him from the inside. He opened his eyes. They were gray, pale as river ice, and they found her face with an alertness that was startling after days of blankness. He didn't speak. He only looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to decide is real. "You need water," Seren said, because it was practical, and she was a practical woman, and she was not prepared for the way those eyes were still tracking her when she brought the cup back. Chapter 3. What he was. His name was Calder Voss. He offered it on the 6th day, after he had managed broth and half a round of flatbread, and established that he could, with considerable effort, sit upright without assistance. Seren Ashvale. She didn't offer her hand. She was mending a boot across the room and didn't look up. "If you're going to stay in my bed, I thought you should know whose it is." A pause in which she could hear him deciding things. "Your bed. You've been sleeping on the floor. I've slept on worse." Another pause. "That isn't—" "Don't." She did look up then, and her voice was mild, but her eyes were not. "Don't apologize. I made the choice. I make all my own choices. It's one of the advantages of having no pack to make them for me." Something shifted in his face at that. Not pity, which she had braced for, but something closer to attention. Real, specific attention. The kind that cost something. "Voss," she said, returning to the boot. "That's a blood compact name." "It is. There are only 3 families who hold blood compact seats in Thornvale." She set the boot down. "Voss is one of them. The Alpha line Voss, specifically." He said nothing, which was its own answer. "So the Alpha King of the Thornvale Compact," she said very calmly, "has been in my bed for 6 days, delirious, and I've been changing his linens." 7 days, Calder Voss said. "And yes." Seren looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked the boot back up. "Well," she said, "you still need to finish the broth." Chapter 4. The document on the shelf. On the 7th day, he noticed the shelf. She watched him see it, the ring first, then the folded document, and watched the particular stillness that came over him. He was moving on his own now, cautiously, testing his legs in short circuits around the small room. When he stopped beneath the shelf, she set down her mending. "I didn't read it," she said. "More than the heading." He reached for the document with a hand that was not quite steady. She noticed he didn't reach for the ring. The heading was enough to tell you what it was. "The Omega auction runs every frost month," she said. "I know. I've received the summons twice. The first time I was too young for my absence to be a fine. The second time my grandmother was dying, and the regional collector took the fine out of my seed stock for spring." Calder looked at her. She could feel the weight of it without meeting it. "Every unmated Omega in Thornvale territory is required to present at the compact auction," she continued. Her voice was perfectly level. She had made it perfectly level through long practice, the way you make a road level through long labor. The bidding opens at a base rate calibrated to Omega designation tier. Wolfless Omegas present at the lowest tier. We're sold at the floor price if anyone bids at all, which is not guaranteed. She finally looked at him. "I have been preparing to attend the auction on the 21st day of the frost month. That is in 14 days. I have been saving since last frost month to afford the travel fee, so that the fine for non-attendance is smaller than the cost of going." The silence in the cottage was very complete. "I drafted that document," Calder said, and his voice had changed into something lower, dredged up from a depth he hadn't used with her before. "Not the original compact, but the current protocols. 3 years ago, when I inherited the Alpha King seat, I ratified the existing system without—" He stopped. "Without thinking about what it was," Seren said. "Without seeing what it was." She looked at him for a long moment. "There's a difference, I know. But from the floor price tier, it looks the same." Chapter 5. What the fever had burned away. On the 8th day, he asked about her wolf. not with the blundering pity she'd fielded from everyone who'd ever learned she was wolfless. He asked the way someone asks about a scar, not to wound, but because the shape of the absence matters to understanding the shape of the person. "I never had one," she said. They were sitting at the table, the first time they'd shared a meal in which he'd been genuinely present. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and relentless. The designation came in at 17. Omega, no shift. The pack used me in the kitchens for a year and a half. Then pack leadership changed and I wasn't worth the bunk space, so I was released. She said released the way it was technically defined, which was also the way it had felt. As though she were something unclipped from its tether rather than anything with will of its own. "Where did you go?" "Here." She gestured at the low ceiling, the 2 small windows, the goats audible through the wall. "My grandmother's cottage. She'd already lost the main property, but this outbuilding had been deeded to her separately. Some ancient agreement the tax collectors kept missing. I fixed the roof. I kept the goats. I grow enough to trade. Alone." "Entirely." She met his eyes. "And I want to be very clear with you, Caldervos. I am not unhappy. I am not waiting to be rescued. I'm telling you this so that you understand what the auction means from the inside, not as policy, but as a thing that will happen to a real person, to a life that is whole and built and mine, and reduce it to a floor-price lot." He was quiet for a long time. The fire snapped and shifted. "When I was sick," he said finally, "I said something. More than once, apparently. Did you hear it?" She looked at him steadily. "You said to tell them you rescinded. All of it." Something moved through his face, recognition, and underneath that, something that looked like resolve finally finding its architecture. "I'd been traveling to Valdrath to meet with the 3 dissenting compact lords who've been pushing for auction reform for 2 years. I was going to refuse them again." His jaw shifted. "I was ambushed on the Thorn Pass Ridge. Fever dart, meant to keep me from arriving and stall the vote." Seren was quiet for a moment. "Someone wanted the auction to continue badly enough to assassinate the Alpha King. Someone with floor-price interests." His eyes darkened. "The auction isn't about finding mates for Omegas. It's a revenue structure for the lords who take the bonding fees." "I know," she said simply. He looked at her as though she had just handed him something he hadn't known he'd lost. "Of course you do." Chapter 6. The Ring. On the 9th night, she couldn't sleep. It wasn't the floor. She had long ago made peace with floors. It was the quality of the silence, which had changed. For 8 nights, the silence had been shaped by the sounds of tending, his breathing, the fire, the intervals of her own vigilance. Now it was simply quiet, and the quiet had a different texture, charged the way air charges before lightning. She was sitting by the banked fire when he appeared in the doorway. He moved carefully, still rebuilding his strength, but he sat down on the floor across from her without asking. Just sat, folding himself down with a matter-of-factness that made her chest do something unsteady. They sat in the firelight without speaking for a while that might have been a few minutes, or considerably more. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said at last. "I know." She'd been watching his strength return like a tide coming in. "You have a vote to catch. A vote to lead." A pause. "Seren, what I said in the fever, you don't owe me a policy change because I nursed you." "I know." He turned to look at her directly, and his face in the firelight was all shadow and silver scar, and those pale river ice eyes. "I'm not offering you one because I owe you. I'm telling you that I see it now. Really see it, from inside your walls and at your table, and I cannot unsee it. That's not debt. That's what happens when someone shows you what you'd been refusing to look at." She said nothing. The fire shifted. "The dissenting lords," he continued, "need my signature and my vote. I have to reach Valdrath before the 21st. If I do, the vote carries." "It carries." She looked at him for a long time. "And if it doesn't?" "Then I use the Alpha King's emergency dissolution authority." His voice was very quiet and very certain. "I've already decided." I decided somewhere in the delirium, I think, between the third and fourth day. Something burns away in a fever, if you're lucky. The things you kept because you'd always kept them. The systems you ratified without seeing. She looked at her hands. You should rest. You have a long ride tomorrow. I know. He didn't move. Can I ask you something? She nodded. The saying? He said. You said it on the third day. I wasn't as far under as I seemed. A wolf that cannot run still knows the way home. You were talking to yourself, not to me. Seren felt the heat rise to her face, but she didn't look away. It's an old saying. My mother's. What does home mean to you in that saying? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, wind found a gap in the eaves and moved through it. It means the direction of your own worth, she said finally. Knowing where it lives, even when everything around you is calling it by the wrong name. He was very still. Get some sleep, Calder Voss, she said softly. Before he stood, he reached into the pocket of his freshly washed coat and set something on the hearthstone between them. The signet ring. He didn't say anything. He just left it there and went back to bed. She sat for a long time looking at the wolf's head inside its crown, burning orange and gold in the last of the firelight. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not know why, only that she was a woman who kept things that required thinking about later, and this was one of those things. Chapter 7. The 10th day. He was gone before she woke. She had expected this. She had prepared for it, or tried to, folding the night's feeling into the same practical compartment where she stored everything that could not be immediately used. What she had not expected was the letter on the table, written in a hand that was controlled and deliberate in the way of someone who had relearned fine motion after fever. Seren, there are words I want to say that I don't have the right to say from a sickbed in someone else's home. So I will say only this. I see you. Not the designation, not the tear, not the useful pair of hands that kept me alive. You, the woman who builds a life from an outbuilding and calls it whole, and means it. I have met many people in my position who called themselves knowledgeable about the compact and its structures. I understood nothing until I lay on your floor. The vote is in 4 days. Wait for the news. CVPS. The ring is yours to keep or return as you choose. I only know I want you to have had it. Seren read it twice, then she folded it along its original creases, tucked it into the same pocket as the ring, and went to feed the goats. Chapter 8. What the messenger brought on the 14th day of the frost month, a compact messenger arrived at her gate. He was young, red-cheeked from riding, and he looked at her outbuilding cottage with the barely disguised bewilderment of someone who had expected something very different at the end of his journey. He was carrying a sealed document. She took it without speaking, turned her back on his bewilderment, and opened it at the table. The official compact seal at the top. Dense language she worked through carefully, the way she worked through everything that mattered. The iron compact of Thornvale hereby dissolves in perpetuity the Omega Auction Protocols as established under Article 9 by unanimous vote of the Blood Compact Council and the authority of Alpha King Calder Voss. All existing summons for the Frost Month auction are hereby rescinded. All previously levied non-attendance fines are hereby refunded. Further protocols establishing Omega autonomy and designation-neutral bonding rights are attached as Compact Amendment 14. She put the document down on the table. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the wood, feeling the grain of it under her palms. Then she went outside and stood in the cold, and let the silence of the snowfield behind her goat shed be the silence it actually was. Not the silence before something was taken from her, but simply the silence of an ordinary winter afternoon in a life that was hers, that had always been hers, that no one would be permitted to auction now or ever. The messenger, still waiting awkwardly at the gate, cleared his throat. There is, also a personal communication, my lady. I was instructed to... Leave it on the post, she said without turning around. I'll fetch it in a moment. She breathed the cold air until it ached cleanly in her lungs. Then she went to read what he had written, and when she had read it, she wrote back. What she wrote was not recorded anywhere, because she chose not to record it, but she wrote out 3 days later in her father's coat with the ring in her pocket and the letter folded against her ribs, traveling toward Valdrath through the Thorn Pass in the bright and biting cold, and she did not look back at the cottage the way people look back when they are leaving something. She looked back at it the way people look at something they are going to return to. Epilogue. 1 year later. A wolf that cannot run still knows the way home. The great hall of Valdrath Compact Keep had not, in living memory, hosted a joining ceremony for an Alpha King and an unshifted Omega. The traditionalists had expressed their concerns through the proper legal channels, which had been summarily dismissed, also through the proper legal channels, with an efficiency that suggested the Alpha King had anticipated each objection in advance and pre-constructed its refusal. Seren Ashvail Voss stood before the fire circle in her own dress, not the Compact's ceremonial offering, which she had examined and declined on grounds of personal aesthetic, a deep green wool that her friend Maret, the weaver in the valley below, had made from measurements and instinct. No train, no veil. She had flowers from her own garden pressed into her hair, frost-dried and copper-colored. Calder stood across the fire circle from her, with his hands held open in the old manner. His face was doing the thing it had learned to do in front of people, which was to contain the version of itself that was for crowds, but she could see past it now to the specific quality of attention underneath. The river ice eyes finding her in a hall full of people, and staying. The Compact Elder read the old words. The fire answered. When it was done, the vows, the joining mark at the wrist, the signing of the amendment documents that had been placed at the joining table as a deliberate and public act. Because Calder had insisted the ceremony double as the signing, and she had agreed, Seren reached into the fold of her dress. She had brought the ring. She had carried it for a full year, in the coat pocket first, then transferred to a small cedar box that she kept on the high shelf above her fireplace, the same shelf where she had placed it the night she found it. She had taken it with her when she'd packed for Valdrath, and worn it on a cord around her neck for the months of negotiation, and the dismantling of the auction system, and the building of Amendment 14, and the long, careful, unhurried discovery of what it was to be truly known by someone who had learned to look. She placed it now in his open palm. Calder looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed his hand around it, and when he lifted his eyes, they were doing something she had not seen them do in any public setting. They were fully open. The thing he usually held back from rooms led all the way forward, undisguised. "You kept it," he said, quiet under the room's noise. "I keep everything that requires thinking about later," she said. "I've finished thinking." He turned her hand over and slid the ring onto the finger where it had always been intended to rest, and the fit was, she registered with a slight breathless shock, exact. Later, at the long table, she sat beside him and ate the food she had consulted on, and talked to people she had chosen to like, and deflected, with serene certainty, the people who weren't sure what to make of her, and the celebration moved around her with its torchlight and its music, and she was not diminished by any of it. Calder leaned close at one point, his shoulder warm against hers, and said low into her hair, "Maret's dress." "Yes." "Tell me you commissioned the Goatshed Cottage to be preserved." She almost laughed. "I told them to fix the roof properly for once, and to leave everything else exactly where it is. We go back at the new moon." "Good." His hand found hers under the table. "I want to sleep on the floor." "You will not," she said. "You'll sleep in the bed, because I have access to proper blankets now, and I intend to use them. But I appreciate the sentiment." He pressed his lips to her temple, and the gesture was so quiet, and so completely without performance, that the person sitting on her other side visibly pretended not to see it out of pure instinct. She thought of her mother's voice, saying the old words into her childhood hair. "A wolf that cannot run still knows the way home." She had carried that saying as consolation for years, then as defiance, then, slowly, quietly, over the 9 days of a fever and the year that followed, she had understood what it had always actually been, not a consolation for the absence of a wolf, a statement of fact about navigation. You did not need the beast to find your direction. You needed to know where your worth lived, and you needed to be willing to move toward it. And the rest. The ring on her finger, the fire, the man with the river ice eyes, the amendment that had already sent refund notices to 400 Omegas across Thornvale territory. The rest was what happened when you did not stop. The ring caught the torchlight and held it. Seren Ashval Voss looked at it for a moment, then looked up, and the hall was full of fire and noise, and she was entirely home. End.